In 1935, a wall of dust a mile and a half high rolled across the Oklahoma Panhandle and turned noon into absolute darkness. Black Sunday, the worst single day of the Dust Bowl. Nobody saw it coming, not at the scale it arrived. But the atmospheric pattern that built toward it, that pattern had a structure, a fingerprint, a specific configuration of ridge and wind and dryness that appeared again and again for years before the catastrophe reached its peak. That fingerprint is on the weather map right now over the American West. Chicago just issued a dust advisory, not a wind advisory, dust advisory. The kind of alert that belongs in Phoenix or Albuquerque just landed in Illinois. And that's not even the strangest part of what's happening right now. 15 fire warnings are forming a single unbroken line from Montana to Minnesota. Denver is about to tie a temperature record from 1915. One atmospheric structure is driving all of it simultaneously, and the last time this specific pattern appeared at this scale over the American interior, the decade that followed turned the Great Plains into a wasteland. Is history repeating? Stick with me, because whether this leads anywhere close to what it led to last time is the question we answer tonight. Before we go any further, if you enjoy what we do here at Project Nightwatch, hit like and subscribe so you don't miss any of our nightly debriefs. Also, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Let's get into it. Part 1. The ridge that shouldn't be this coherent. 296 active National Weather Service alerts are up right now across the United States. 296. And if you look at a map of where they're clustered, something jumps out immediately. Not because the alerts are scattered randomly across the country the way you'd expect from a normal spring weather pattern, but because they're not scattered at all. They're organized. They're running in a line, a continuous arc stretching from Montana down through the Dakotas, threading through Nebraska, cutting across Minnesota, and bleeding into the edges of Wisconsin. 15 red flag warnings forming one unbroken chain across the northern plains. And the thing that makes this genuinely strange is not that fire weather warnings exist in May. It's that they're sitting in a single connected band rather than the fragmented clusters you normally see. When weather gets extreme, it usually gets extreme in isolated pockets. Different systems, different drivers, different timing. What you're looking at right now is something different. What you're looking at right now is synchronized, and it doesn't stop at the plains. Swing your attention west to the Blue Mountains region on the border of Oregon and Washington, and you've got high wind warnings forecasting 65-mile-per-hour gusts coming through on Wednesday. Not unusual for the Pacific Northwest in winter, genuinely strange for May. Now come back east all the way to Chicago. Chicago, which is surrounded by farmland and Great Lakes moisture, and everything you'd associate with the word Midwest, just issued a blowing dust advisory, not a wind advisory. A dust advisory, the kind of alert that belongs in Arizona or New Mexico, not in Illinois. And the reason they issued it is that the boundary layer moisture readings south of Interstate 80, the amount of water vapor in the lower atmosphere, have dropped to levels you normally see in the desert Southwest, below 5 grams per kilogram in Chicago in May. That is not a minor fluctuation. That is the atmosphere in the American Midwest behaving like it belongs to a completely different climate zone. And then there's Denver. On Wednesdays, Denver is forecast to hit 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which sounds like a warm spring day until you check the record books and find out that 90 degrees in Denver on May 13th would tie a daily temperature record set in 1915. 1915. A record that has stood for 111 years. A record set before the United States entered World War I, before the Roaring Twenties, before the stock market crash, before the Dust Bowl. That number, 111 years, is not just historically interesting. It's a signal. Because the kind of atmospheric structure that produces a 90-degree day in Denver in early May, the kind of structure that holds heat like a lid over an entire region, is the same kind of structure that, when it persists and repeats, begins to look like something the meteorological record hasn't seen at this scale since the 1930s. Here's what you need to understand, and this is the thing that transforms a list of weather alerts into an actual story. All of these events, the red flag arc across the plains, the 65-mile-per-hour winds in the Blue Mountains, the desert dry air in Chicago, the 111-year heat record in Denver, are not separate weather events with separate causes. They are not 4 different stories happening to occur on the same week. They are the outputs of a single atmospheric structure. One feature, one mechanism, a 588 decameter mid-tropospheric ridge sitting over the American West. And if that phrase means nothing to you right now, stay with me, because by the time this is over, it's going to mean quite a lot. A ridge in the atmosphere is essentially the opposite of a trough. Where a trough is a downward dip in the pressure patterns at altitude, the kind of structure that drags in moisture, spins up storms, and keeps temperatures cool. A ridge is an upward bulge, a mountain of air pressure floating miles above the surface, And the thing about a ridge is what it does to the air beneath it. When atmospheric pressure is high and the air is being pushed downward from above, it compresses. Compressing air heats it up. That's not a metaphor, as it's thermodynamics. The same physics that makes a bicycle pump warm when you compress air through it. So you get warmer temperatures at the surface. You get drier conditions because descending air suppresses cloud formation and precipitation, and you get acceleration of surface winds because the pressure gradients around the ridge's edges create flow that moves fast and carries heat. That's the machine. And right now, one machine is running simultaneously across an enormous slice of the North American continent, producing outputs in Montana, outputs in Oregon, outputs in Illinois, outputs in Colorado, all at the same time, all from the same source. Meteorologists have a phrase for this kind of alignment: synoptic coherence. It means that multiple hazards across multiple regions are not just occurring simultaneously. They are mechanically linked. They share a cause. And synoptic coherence at this scale, with this many hazard types locked into a single pattern, is rare. It's the kind of thing that makes atmospheric scientists stop and look twice, because the normal state of affairs is messier, more fragmented, more variable. What's happening right now is unusually clean, unusually organized, unusually coherent. Now, is that a problem? Well, that depends entirely on what happens next. Because here's the thing about coherent atmospheric patterns. They can be transient or they can be persistent. They can flash into existence, produce a dramatic week of extremes, and then break down as the jet stream shifts and Pacific moisture floods back in. Or they can lock. They can settle into a configuration that repeats, that rebuilds, that refuses to move. And the difference between those two outcomes is the difference between a memorable weather week and the beginning of something the history books already have a name for. The 15 red flag warnings forming a continuous arc right now are not sitting where red flag warnings usually sit in spring. They're displaced northward. The typical fire weather threat zone in early May leans toward the southern plains, Texas, Oklahoma, the southern Rockies. What's happening right now is shifted several hundred miles toward the north. And that displacement matters because it tells you something about the geometry of the ridge, how far north its influence is reaching, how deeply it's reorganizing the normal flow of moisture and temperature across the continent. A ridge that pushes fire weather conditions into Montana and Minnesota in the second week of May is a ridge that is doing something unusual with the large-scale circulation of the atmosphere. And there's a word for the underlying pattern that produces this kind of unusual circulation, a pattern that the data right now, today, is starting to resemble. The question is whether what's forming over the American West is just a transient ridge with an impressive resume, or the leading edge of something that, when it appeared the last time at this scale, left the American Great Plains looking like the surface of a different planet. That's not hyperbole, it's history. And history, it turns out, has a very uncomfortable way of rhyming. Part 2. The geometry of the event. Let me tell you what normal looks like, because you can't appreciate how abnormal this is without the baseline. In a typical early May weather pattern over North America, the jet stream is somewhere in the process of its seasonal migration northward. The Pacific storm track is still somewhat active, sending moisture pulses into the western states on a roughly weekly cycle. Pressure systems form, move east, dissipate. Fire weather conditions can develop in the southern plains when dry air and strong winds coincide, but they tend to be localized. A red flag warning here, another 1-200 miles away, both driven by regional conditions rather than a single continental scale mechanism. The atmosphere in May is usually noisy, variable, transitional. It doesn't usually organize itself into a single coherent machine that runs the same type of extreme across a 2,000-mile arc simultaneously. What's happening right now violates that baseline in at least 3 distinct ways. And if you want to understand why this matters, you need to sit with each violation for a moment before the full picture comes into focus. The first violation is geographic. Those 15 red flag warnings are not sitting in the southern plains where May fire weather warnings belong. They're sitting in the northern plains, Montana, the Dakotas, Nebraska, Minnesota, Wisconsin. That's a latitudinal displacement of roughly 300 to 400 miles northward compared to the climatological norm for this time of year. Fire weather risk doesn't just shift north because temperatures went up a few degrees. It shifts north because the atmospheric circulation pattern has reorganized in a way that moves the zone of warm, dry, wind-accelerated air into a region that statistically should not be experiencing it yet. Early season fire weather in the northern plains means the ridge is reaching further poleward than it should be, which tells you something about both its intensity and its geometry. This is not a normal intensity ridge sitting in a normal position. This is an amplified feature with an unusually high northern reach, and that distinction is important for reasons that will become clear when we get into the mechanics of what drives persistence. The second violation is the spatial continuity of the warning band itself. This is subtle, but it matters enormously. When fire weather conditions develop across a region, they usually develop in clusters, isolated pockets where all the ingredients happen to coincide at the right moment in the right place. You get a warning in one county, a gap, another warning 50 miles away, another gap. The patchwork reflects the underlying messiness of the atmosphere, the way different microclimates and terrain features create local variations, even within a generally dry, windy pattern. What you're looking at right now is not a patchwork. It's a line, a continuous arc from Montana to Minnesota, with no gaps, no interruptions. Just a single unbroken band of simultaneous red flag conditions. That kind of continuity requires every ingredient, the wind, the low humidity, the dry fuel, to be present simultaneously across the entire arc. Which means the atmospheric forcing producing these conditions is not just strongs, it's spatially coherent. It's delivering the same set of extreme conditions to a 2,000-mile corridor at the same time. That's the kind of thing that happens when you have a single, clean, dominant atmospheric feature rather than a collection of separate systems. The third violation is the one that should make you stop and think because it's the weirdest one, Chicago. Chicago does not get blowing dust advisories. Chicago is at 41 degrees north latitude, surrounded by some of the most agriculturally intensive land in the world, bordered to the north and east by the Great Lakes, embedded in the Corn Belt. It is not a place the National Weather Service normally needs to worry about dust mobilization. But south of Interstate 80 this week, boundary layer moisture is running below 5 grams per kilogram. Let me give you a reference point for that number. 5 grams per kilogram is what you'd measure in the desert Southwest on a dry day in the summer. It's the moisture content of air that has been desiccated, stripped, wrung out, and it's appearing in Illinois because the same ridge that's baking Denver and accelerating winds through the Blue Mountains has pushed so far east so consistently that it's fundamentally drying out the lower atmosphere across the entire midsection of the country, and that's where the dust comes in. For loose soil to become airborne, you need two things working together: dry surface conditions and wind strong enough to overcome the threshold velocity for particle movement. The dust event that's developing south of Chicago has both, and the reason it has both is the same reason Denver is tying a 111-year record, and the Blue Mountains are getting 65-mile-per-hour gusts. One ridge, one mechanism, one fingerprint across an entire continent. Now, here's what makes this even more interesting from a structural standpoint. A normal spring weather system, even an intense one, tends to produce a pattern that's easy to understand in terms of cause and effect. This storm produced this wind, which caused this dust, which moved in this direction. Discrete cause, discrete effect, traceable chain. What you're dealing with right now is a pattern where the cause is singular, but the effects are simultaneous and geographically diverse. The ridge doesn't produce one event at a time. It produces all of them at once, synchronizing conditions across an enormous area so that the entire system behaves as a single unit. That's not how routine spring weather works. That's how an amplified, persistent atmospheric regime works. And the word persistent is doing a lot of work in that sentence because there's a concept in meteorology called a locked configuration, a pattern that, once established, resists the normal mechanisms of breakdown. Typically, a ridge over the American West erodes when the jet stream shifts, when a Pacific trough undercuts it from the west, when moisture returned from the south breaks the dryness feedback. These are the natural immune responses of the atmosphere. They usually win. The ridge weakens, moves east, and the system resets. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes, the configuration locks. The ridge rebuilds before the trough can undercut it. The Pacific flow remains blocked. The dryness feedback accelerates instead of moderating. And when that happens, you stop talking about a weather event and start talking about a weather regime. We are not there yet. To be completely clear, 1 week of amplified ridge conditions does not constitute a regime. But you don't have to be in a regime to be in the early stages of one. And the thing about early stages is that by the time the evidence is unambiguous, the window for the most important observations has already passed. The question of whether this is a transient ridge or an emerging regime is not a question you can answer by watching it for 3 days. It's a question that gets answered over 2 to 4 weeks of observational data, which means we are right now in the observation window. The data is being written in real time, and the data at this exact moment looks more organized, more spatially coherent, and more structurally anomalous than a run-of-the-mill spring ridge has any business looking. Something about the geometry of this event keeps pulling the mind toward a pattern it has seen before, in a different era, under different circumstances, but with the same fundamental shape. And that pattern has a name, and the name comes with a history that nobody in the American Great Plains is eager to repeat. Part 3. The surface is telling the same story everywhere. Let's follow the air, not the abstract version of it, not the pressure systems on a weather map, but the actual air, the molecules, the warmth, the dryness, as it moves from the Pacific coast across the interior of the continent, and watch what it does to every surface it touches along the way. Because if you follow the air, you see something remarkable. You see that the same air mass is leaving its signature across an enormous geographic canvas, transforming as it travels, but always carrying the fingerprint of the same origin. That ridge sitting over the west, pressing down, warming up, driving the flow. Start in the Pacific Northwest. Air moving in from the Pacific approaches the Cascade Range and the Blue Mountains, a wall of terrain that forces the flow to either go over or go around. In this case, the pressure gradient created by the ridge is strong enough to push the air up and over the terrain. As the air ascends the windward side of the mountains, it cools at a predictable rate and drops whatever moisture it was carrying as precipitation on the western slopes. That's the wet side. But then the air crests the ridge and begins to descend on the eastern slopes. And this is where something important happens. Descending air undergoes adiabatic compression, the same physics we talked about earlier, but now working in a specific geographic context. As the air drops in altitude, it compresses under its own weight, and compression generates heat. Every 1,000 feet of descent adds roughly 5.5 degrees Fahrenheit to the air temperature. And crucially, the air is also drying out. All the moisture it lost on the way up doesn't come back. So by the time the air reaches the foothills of the Blue Mountains on the eastern downsloping side, it's warmer than when it started, drier than when it started, and it's moving fast because the pressure gradient driving the whole thing is still pushing it forward, 65 miles per hour. That's what the high wind warnings are calling for through the Blue Mountains foothills on Wednesday. That's not just a wind speed, that's a threshold. At 65 miles per hour, mature trees begin to break. Unsecured structures face significant risk. Fire, if it starts under these conditions, doesn't just burn, it runs. It outpaces suppression efforts, jumps fire breaks, creates its own wind field. As the heat it generates accelerates the surrounding flow. The terrain that produces these downslope winds is working like a giant compressor and accelerator simultaneously, and the ridge is the pressure source powering the whole mechanism. Now follow the air east. The same air mass, now dried by its descent off the mountains, continues moving across the high desert of eastern Oregon and Idaho, crossing into the northern plains. It's still warm, it's still dry, and it's still being driven by the same pressure gradient from the same ridge. As it reaches Montana and the Dakotas, it encounters the flat geometry of the Great Plains. No mountain barriers to force it upward, no terrain features to slow it down, just open land running for hundreds of miles in every direction. The wind accelerates across the flat. The humidity drops further because the air has been traveling over increasingly desiccated land, picking up heat from sun-baked soil and losing none of its dryness. And the relative humidity in the red flag warning zones collapses into the range of 19 to 25%. 19%, 25%. For fire behavior, that's the zone where everything changes. Above 30% relative humidity, vegetation retains enough moisture to resist ignition under most circumstances. Below 20%, fine fuels, dry grass, dead brush, the winter-kill vegetation that hasn't yet been replaced by spring growth, become critically susceptible. A spark from a vehicle, a downed power line, lightning from a distant storm can initiate a fire that the combination of wind and low humidity then turns into something that moves faster than most people think fire can move. The northern plains in mid-May is in the early part of the growing season, which means the grasses that will eventually green up and provide some natural resistance haven't done that yet. The land is covered in the previous season's dead, dry material, and it's sitting under air that's as dry as the Sonoran Desert, being driven by winds that crossed 2 mountain ranges before arriving. This is not a recipe for caution. This is a recipe for exactly the kind of fire weather emergency that 15 simultaneous red flag warnings represent. Keep following the air east. It crosses the Missouri River, threads through Iowa, and into Illinois. And somewhere in this journey, something interesting happens to the atmospheric structure above it. The boundary layer, the zone of the atmosphere closest to the surface, where it's most directly influenced by surface heating and wind mixing, begins to deepen. When the ridge forces air downward from above, it compresses the boundary layer. But the intense surface heating under the ridge also drives convective mixing from below, turbulence that deepens the boundary layer from the bottom up. The two processes combine to produce a deep, well-mixed layer of dry, warm air that extends from the surface up through several thousand feet of altitude. And a deep, well-mixed boundary layer is extraordinarily efficient at something specific, picking up loose material from the surface and carrying it aloft. That is what's happening south of Interstate 80 in Illinois. The mixing ratio below 5 grams per kilogram means that the lower atmosphere is drier than the desert southwest on most days. The boundary layer is deep enough and turbulent enough to generate vertical transport of surface particles. and the fields south of Chicago in May are in a vulnerable state. Planting season is either just finished or still in progress, which means the soil has been recently tilled and is exposed. The crops that will eventually cover and anchor the soil with a canopy of leaves and root systems are seedlings at best, providing essentially zero protection against wind erosion. The surface is exposed, the air above it is desert dry, the winds driving horizontally across it are strong, and the result is a blowing dust advisory in Chicago. Something that, to anyone who grew up with a particular set of assumptions about Midwestern weather, sounds wrong in a way that's hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. This is the single fingerprint phenomenon in its clearest expression. You have one air mass that originated as Pacific flow, was transformed by descent off mountain terrain, was further dried and heated as it crossed the high-altitude interior, was driven eastward by the pressure gradient of a single ridge, and is now simultaneously producing 65-mile-per-hour winds in Oregon, red flag fire conditions across the northern plains, and dust mobilization in Illinois. Different surfaces, different terrains, different climatological backgrounds, all receiving the same message from the same source. The atmosphere, right now, is behaving as a single synchronized system rather than a collection of separate regional weather patterns. And here's the thing that should be sitting in the back of your mind as you process all of this. What we've just described, the mechanism, the geography, the fingerprint, is not just the story of this week. It's the structural outline of something that happened before. A ridge over the west forcing dry, warm, wind-accelerated air across the plains, reaching the Midwest as a dust-capable mass, pulling temperature records out of their century-long sleep. That combination of outputs, driven by that combination of mechanisms, points back toward a chapter in American history that most people know by name, but very few understand mechanically. And understanding it mechanically is the only way to answer the question that matters. Is what's forming over the American West right now the echo of that history, or the beginning of its repetition? Part 4. The 1915 anchor, 90 degrees Fahrenheit in Denver on May 13th. That's the forecast. And when the National Weather Service looks at that number against the historical record for that specific date, what they find is that the last time Denver reached 90 degrees on May 13th was in 1915, 111 years ago. Let that sit for a moment, because the longevity of that record is not just a curiosity, it's a piece of evidence. 1915 was a specific moment in history with a specific atmospheric and climatic context. The year the RMS Lusitania was sunk by a German submarine. The year that World War I was still in what the people living through it believed was an early phase. The year that the American Great Plains was still more than a decade away from the catastrophe that would define it in the history books. But meteorologically, 1915 was sitting inside a climatic era, the early decades of the 20th century, that shared certain structural characteristics with what preceded the Dust Bowl. The atmospheric circulation patterns of that era were in some respects more favorable to the kind of persistent western ridging that drives the mechanism we're watching right now. And the fact that the most recent time Denver matched this temperature on this specific date was inside that era is not on its own proof of anything, but it is a detail that a careful observer should not set aside. To understand why a daily temperature record from 1915 matters as more than a trivia fact, you need to understand what kind of atmospheric event is capable of producing 90 degrees in Denver on the 13th of May. Denver sits at roughly 5,280 feet above sea level, the mile-high cities, as the license plates will tell you. At that elevation, the atmosphere is naturally thinner and less capable of retaining surface heat than cities at sea level. May in Denver is typically a transitional month. Warm by day, often still cool by night. Variable, with a meaningful chance of late-season snow events as cold Pacific systems occasionally breach the Rockies. A 90-degree day in early May is not just warm. It requires the atmosphere above Denver to be structured in a very specific way. A strong, well-placed ridge holding the upper-level flow in a pattern that suppresses cloud development, maximizes surface insulation, and drives downslope warming from the west. You don't get 90 degrees in Denver on May 13th from a routine warm spell. You get it from an amplified upper-level ridge doing exactly what the current ridge is doing, which means that when this record was set in 1915, the atmosphere over the American West was producing the same kind of structural configuration we're watching today. Same mechanism, same geography, same output. And the record survived for 111 years because in all the time since, through the Dust Bowl itself, through the droughts of the 1950s, through the heat waves of the 1980s, through the accelerating warming of the 21st century, the specific combination of ridge placement, amplitude, and timing that produces 90 degrees in Denver on May 13th specifically did not repeat until this week. There's a concept in climatology called upper tail compression. As the climate warms, the entire distribution of temperatures shifts upward. The average goes up, the cold extremes become less extreme, and the warm extremes become more extreme. But the rate at which warm extremes at the very top of the historical distribution are being challenged is not uniform across seasons and geographies. For early season extremes specifically, events that push into late spring territory like this Denver record, the current atmospheric pattern is creating what you might call a recurrence of pre-modern configurations. Configurations that were last common during the early to mid-20th century before the changes in land use, agricultural practices, and global circulation that followed the Dust Bowl altered the surface conditions that interact with these patterns. And the Dust Bowl connection is not casual, it's not rhetorical. The atmospheric conditions that produced the Dust Bowl in the 1930s were not primarily the result of drought alone. Drought was the visible surface expression of something deeper. A persistent, repeating western ridge that blocked Pacific moisture, drove warm, dry flow across the plains repeatedly for multiple years, and created the extended surface drying that reduced the soil to a state where it could be mobilized by the wind. The people who lived through the Black Sunday dust storm of April 14, 1935, the day a wall of dust, a mile and a half high, rolled across the Oklahoma Panhandle and turned noon into absolute darkness. Those people had been living for years under an atmosphere that was doing, repeatedly and persistently, exactly what the atmosphere over the American West is doing right now in the span of a single week. Now, to be precise about something important, a single week of ridge-driven extremes is not the Dust Bowl. It is not close to the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl required years of persistent patterns, combined with decades of soil degradation from unsustainable agricultural practices, combined with oceanic conditions that reinforce the blocking patterns. One amplified ridge in May of 2026 does not constitute a return of the 1930s. But the record from 1915 is doing something editorially important that I want to be deliberate about. It is giving us a concrete, verified historical anchor point that connects the current atmospheric configuration to the era immediately preceding the Dust Bowl. It is telling us in the clearest possible terms that the structure of what's happening right now is not modern, not unprecedented in the general sense, but rather a configuration that the climate of the early 20th century, the climate of the era before and during the Dust Bowl's development, produced with some regularity. And it is doing so with a precision that a century-old untied record uniquely provides. 111 years without this specific combination of conditions on this specific date. And now, here it is again. The atmosphere of reproducing, with unsettling fidelity, the exact signature of the era that ended with American farmers abandoning their land by the millions and driving west with everything they owned, packed into trucks, chasing a California that turned out to be less welcoming than the billboards promised. If this ridge breaks down by the weekend and May returns to normal, the record tie becomes a footnote. Interesting, historically notable, ultimately isolated. But if the ridge rebuilds, if the same structural pattern reappears in 2 weeks or 3, if the red flag arc forms again across the same corridor, if Denver flirts with more records and Chicago chokes on more dust, then the 1915 anchor becomes something else entirely. It becomes the first data point in a pattern, and the question of whether one data point becomes 2 and then 3 is the question that the next several weeks will either answer or leave open. Act 1 is complete. The structure exists. The signals are real. The historical resonance is documented. The only question that remains, the question that nobody, not the National Weather Service, not the climate modelers, not the ensemble forecast systems, can answer yet is whether what's sitting over the American West right now is the last act of a dramatic spring weather event, or the opening scene of something the continent hasn't seen at this scale since the conditions that preceded the worst environmental catastrophe in modern American history. Everything from here is about understanding the mechanism well enough to know which one it is. Part 5. What a Dust Bowl pattern actually is. Most people, when they hear Dust Bowl, think of the photographs, the sepia images of families on dirt roads, of children with covered faces, of houses buried to the windowsills in sand. They think of John Steinbeck and the Jodes. They think of the Okies heading west on Route 66. They think of a social catastrophe, which it absolutely was, but they miss the mechanism. They miss the engine, and the engine is where the connection to what's happening right now actually lives. The Dust Bowl was not, at its core, a drought. Drought was a symptom. The engine was an atmospheric pattern, a specific configuration of the large-scale circulation of the Northern Hemisphere that, once established, repeated itself season after season with a consistency that went far beyond any individual weather event. At the center of that pattern was a persistent western ridge sitting over roughly the same geography as the current ridge, doing roughly the same thing, blocking the Pacific moisture that would normally flow into the Great Plains, driving warm and dry downsloping air across the interior, maintaining anomalously high temperatures and anomalously low humidity across an enormous section of the continent for months at a time, and doing so not once, but repeatedly year after year from the late 1920s into the late 1930s. The ridge was not always the same intensity. It wasn't a single unchanging feature frozen in place for a decade. It waxed and waned, broke down occasionally, allowed brief periods of moisture return, but it kept coming back. That's the key word: recurrence. Not intensity, not even total duration. Recurrence. The pattern kept rebuilding in approximately the same geometry, with approximately the same effects across approximately the same geography, and it's the recurrence that created the systemic conditions for the Dust Bowl, not any single extreme event. It's the difference between a fever that breaks after 2 days and a fever that keeps returning every week for 3 years. The individual episodes might be similar in temperature. What's different is what the repeated episodes do to the underlying system, and there's something else that drove the persistence: oceanic conditions. The Pacific and Atlantic Ocean temperatures in the 1930s were configured in a way that atmospheric scientists, with the benefit of modern reanalysis data, now recognize as being broadly analogous to what's known as a La Niña-like state. Cooler than average waters in the central and eastern tropical Pacific, which tend to favor the development of persistent western ridges, and reduced moisture transport into the interior of North America. The ocean wasn't the only factor, but it was providing a sustained background forcing that made the atmosphere's return to the ridge pattern more likely with each passing season. The ocean and the atmosphere were reinforcing each other, locked in a feedback that kept the dry, warm, ridge-dominated patterns in place long after any single event would have broken down. Here's why this matters for understanding the current situation. What we're watching this week is the atmospheric half of that equation appearing in isolation. The ridge is there. The structural output, the red flags, the wind warnings, the dust, the temperature records is there. But the oceanic forcing that, in the 1930s, reinforced and sustained the pattern is currently different. The Pacific is not in a Dust Bowl era La Niña configuration right now. We'll come back to that complexity later because it matters for the question of recurrence. But the point is this: the atmospheric engine is running. It's producing the same structural signature as the Dust Bowl's driving mechanism. Whether the oceanic support for keeping that engine running is present is a separate question. A critical one, but separate. One machine, one fingerprint, 1 week of continent-spanning synchronized extremes. The atmospheric half of the Dust Bowl pattern is operating right now. And understanding that it's operating, not speculatively, not as a metaphor, but as a documented meteorological configuration, is what separates this story from the standard extreme weather is concerning narrative. This is not about any individual record or any particular firework outbreak. This is about recognizing a structural pattern when it appears, tracking it honestly without overstating what one event can prove, and understanding what it would take for the pattern to transition from an isolated episode into something with genuine long-term consequences. One event says nothing on its own, but the first event of a series is indistinguishable from any other event until the second one arrives. That's the uncomfortable truth sitting at the center of this story. The Dust Bowl's atmospheric signature is present right now over the American West. The question of whether it stays is the question that determines whether this story is a weather event or something more. Part 6, Pattern Match versus Outcome. Let's be precise, because precision is what makes the difference between useful analysis and catastrophizing. What is actually matching the Dust Bowl pattern today, and what isn't? Because both halves of that answer matter enormously for understanding what we're looking at. Matches are concrete and documentable. Start with ridge placement. The current 588 decameter mid-tropospheric ridge is centered over the American West in approximately the same geographic position as the persistent ridges that characterized the Dust Bowl era. This is not a ridge sitting over the Pacific or displaced toward Canada. It's sitting over the interior western United States, which is precisely the position that maximizes its drying and warming effect on the Great Plains. Placement matters as much as intensity. A ridge of equal strength, sitting 200 miles north, would have meaningfully different impacts on the surface conditions below it. It's sitting in the right place from the perspective of someone trying to reproduce Dust Bowl conditions. The wind fields are matching. The acceleration of dry, downsloping air across the plains, the pressure gradients producing 65-mile-per-hour gusts in terrain-influenced zones, the sustained surface winds driving fire weather conditions across a continuous corridor. These are not just anomalous. They are structurally consistent with the wind patterns that characterize the most damaging episodes of the Dust Bowl. The winds that moved topsoil from Oklahoma and Kansas into the Atlantic Ocean in the 1930s were not meteorologically exotic. They were driven by the same combination of ridge-induced pressure gradients, downsloping adiabatic warming, and reduced surface roughness that we're documenting in the current pattern. The humidity collapse is matching. Boundary layer moisture readings below 5 grams per kilogram in Illinois. Relative humidity of 19 to 25% in the red flag warning zones. These are not marginally dry conditions. They are critically dry conditions, and they're appearing simultaneously across a geography that extends from the Pacific Northwest into the Midwest. The signature of extreme atmospheric drying across the interior of the continent is one of the clearest fingerprints of the Dust Bowl's driving mechanism, and it's present right now. The dust mobilization is beginning. A blowing dust advisory in Chicago is not just a weather alert. It's evidence that the surface conditions and atmospheric conditions are combining to reproduce, at least locally and briefly, one of the most iconic visual signatures of the Dust Bowl era. The specific fact that boundary layer moisture south of Interstate 80 is running at desert southwest levels, while soil sits exposed from recent tilling and surface winds, are strong enough to move particles horizontally. This is the Dust Bowl mechanism operating in miniature, not at scale, not with the multi-year soil degradation that characterized 1930s Kansas, but the mechanism is present. The trigger is firing. Now, here's what isn't matching, and this is where intellectual honesty demands equal attention. The Great Plains is not in the multi-year drought that preceded the worst Dust Bowl episodes. Soil moisture across the region, while below normal in some areas, does not reflect the cumulative multi-year drying that characterized the early 1930s. The conservation infrastructure put in place after the Dust Bowl, the shelter belts, the conservation tillage practices, the soil binding from perennial root systems is still partially functional, though we'll examine how functional in the next section. And most critically, this is week 1 of an amplified ridge episode, not year 3. The systemic conditions for a Dust Bowl scale event require the cumulative effects of repeated pattern recurrence over an extended period. We are nowhere near that threshold. But here's the analytical point that matters more than either of the above. We are seeing the trigger conditions right now this week. The conditions that, if sustained and repeated, would begin to move the system in the direction of the Dust Bowl pattern's most damaging phase are present today. Triggers matter more than outcomes in early-stage analysis, not because triggers inevitably produce outcomes, but because they are the only observable early indicator that a transition might be underway. You cannot observe a multi-year pattern after 1 week. You can observe whether the conditions capable of driving such a pattern are present, and they are. There's a concept in complex systems, science called threshold behavior. Systems that have been gradually stressed, a soil ecosystem losing moisture over months, an atmospheric circulation pattern drifting toward a particular configuration, don't usually fail gradually and linearly. They tend to maintain apparent stability as the underlying conditions approach a critical threshold and then transition rapidly once that threshold is crossed. This is sometimes called a tipping point, though that phrase has been overused to the point of losing precision. The technically accurate way to describe it is a bifurcation. The system reaches a point where the stable state it's been in becomes unstable, and it rapidly shifts to a different stable state. For soil and atmosphere combined, that bifurcation, the point where conditions shift from recovering between events to degrading cumulatively, is exactly what the early Dust Bowl years represented. Not a single catastrophe, but a tipping of the balance. We are not at that threshold, but the threshold doesn't announce itself. It doesn't send out a press release. The way you identify an approach to threshold behavior is by watching for the pattern to recur, for the trigger to fire not once, but repeatedly, each time leaving the system slightly less able to recover, slightly more vulnerable to the next episode. The current pattern is the first data point. The next 2 to 4 weeks will determine whether it's the only data point or the first in a sequence that the historical record already has a name for. Part 7. The land buffer is thinner than it looks. After the Dust Bowl, the United States undertook what was arguably the most significant soil conservation effort in the history of modern agriculture. The federal government didn't just help farmers survive the disaster, it built an institutional infrastructure designed to prevent recurrence. The Soil Conservation Service was established. The Great Plains Shelter Belt Project planted hundreds of millions of trees across the Plains states in a network of windbreaks designed to reduce surface wind speeds, retain soil moisture, and provide a physical barrier against the kind of wind erosion that had stripped topsoil from millions of acres. Conservation tillage practices were developed and incentivized, replacing the moldboard plowing that had left soils pulverized and vulnerable with techniques that retained crop residue on the surface, providing both moisture retention and wind resistance. The Conservation Reserve Program, created in 1985, paid farmers to take highly erodible cropland out of production entirely, replacing it with perennial grasses and native vegetation whose deep root systems could hold soil against even significant wind events. At its peak, the Conservation Reserve Program enrolled roughly 37 million acres of highly erodible land, an area larger than the state of Iowa, taken entirely out of crop production and maintained under permanent vegetative cover. That is an enormous buffer. That represents a meaningful chunk of the most vulnerable land in the Great Plains, protected by deep-rooted perennial plants that anchor the soil regardless of what the atmosphere is doing above it. The word to focus on was because the Conservation Reserve Program enrollment has declined substantially from that 37 million acre peak. Recent enrollment figures show the program covering fewer than 23 million acres, a decline of nearly 14 million acres from its high point. That's 14 million acres of previously protected, highly erodible land that has returned to cultivation, or been converted to other uses, or simply lost its vegetative cover through program expiration and non-renewal. 14 million acres. That's roughly the size of West Virginia removed from the buffer. And the shelter belts are thinner too. The windbreak network planted during the New Deal era has suffered from decades of agricultural consolidation, where larger operations prefer clean field farming without the irregularities that tree rows introduce. Individual shelter belt trees have died without replacement. In some areas, rows that were planted in the 1930s and 40s have reached the end of their natural lifespan and haven't been renewed. The physical barrier that was supposed to break the wind before it could accelerate across open land and mobilize topsoil has gaps now that it didn't have 30 years ago. What does this mean in the context of the pattern we're watching? It means that the modern Great Plains is more resilient against wind erosion than the bare, pulverized landscape of the early 1930s, but it is less resilient than it was at the peak of the post-Dust Bowl conservation era. The buffer is real, but it's thinner. The protection exists, but it has margins. And the margins matter most when the atmospheric forcing is at its most extreme, which is precisely the condition we're discussing right now. A wind event that would have been handled comfortably by the full Conservation Reserve Program enrollment, an intact shelter belt network at its peak, might push through the reduced buffer of the current system and produce soil mobilization that would not have occurred under the stronger protection. The Chicago Dust Advisory is not primarily about agricultural soil in Illinois. Illinois has good conservation practices and relatively stable soil conditions for the most part, but it's telling you something about where the atmospheric conditions are severe enough to overcome whatever buffer exists. And if the atmospheric forcing were sustained, if the ridge returned and the surface drying accumulated over weeks and months rather than days, the question of buffer adequacy becomes much less theoretical. The Dust Bowl didn't defeat a pristine landscape. It defeated a landscape that had been progressively stripped of its protective capacity by a combination of agricultural practices and cumulative drought. The modern landscape has better protection than the 1930s, but the protective systems are not at their strongest, and the atmospheric forcing system we're watching is capable of stressing them. This is the land side of the equation that the atmosphere is riding on this week. One side of the ledger says the buffer exists and is meaningful. The other side says the buffer has been eroding for decades and is thinner than it looks from the outside. If the ridge that's sitting over the American West right now turns out to be transient, the thinner buffer never gets fully tested. But if the pattern comes back, if the trigger fires again in 3 weeks and again in 6, and the soil moisture keeps declining and the vegetation canopy can't recover between events, then the adequacy of a buffer that's 14 million acres smaller than its post-Dust Bowl peak becomes the most important agricultural question in the country.
Part 8. Amplified Rossby Waves. To understand why some ridges stay and some ridges leave, why some patterns lock and others move through, you need to go up, not to the surface, not to the lower troposphere where the red flag warnings and wind advisories live, but to the upper atmosphere, to the altitude where the jet stream flows and the large-scale waves that govern everything below them are actually controlled. Because the jet stream is not just a river of wind in the upper atmosphere, it is the organizing principle of mid-latitude weather. It is the boundary between the cold polar air masses and the warm subtropical air masses. It is the track along which storm systems develop and move. It is the reason that California gets rain in winter and not in summer, that the Great Plains is both breadbasket and dust bowl depending on the decade, that Europe can swing from flood to drought within a single season. And when it behaves normally, it's in a relatively tight, fast-moving configuration that limits how long any single pattern can persist in one location. The jet stream doesn't move in a straight line. It meanders. It develops waves, large-scale undulations called Rossby waves, named for the Swedish-American meteorologist Carl Gustaf Rossby, who first described their dynamics in the 1930s and 40s. Rossby was working at a time when upper atmosphere observations were primitive by modern standards. Radiosondes had only recently come into operational use, and the three-dimensional picture of the atmosphere was still being assembled from a sparse and uneven network of balloon ascents. That he could derive the mathematical framework for these planetary-scale waves from first principles, connecting the dynamics of rotating fluids to the large-scale behavior of the atmosphere, was a feat of theoretical clarity that still looks remarkable from where we stand. These waves are a natural feature of the atmospheric circulation, and they're responsible for the sequence of ridges and troughs that produce the alternating episodes of warm and cold, dry and wet that characterize mid-latitude weather. Under normal conditions, Rossby waves have a relatively limited amplitude. The undulations are modest in their northward and southward excursions, and they move progressively eastward around the hemisphere so that any given region experiences the full cycle of ridge and trough conditions over a week or two. Weather happens, systems pass through, the atmosphere breathes. Under abnormal conditions, the waves amplify, the undulations get bigger, the ridges reach further north. The troughs plunge further south. And critically, this is the part that changes everything. The waves slow down and sometimes stop moving entirely. Think of what that means in physical terms. The normal rhythm of mid-latitude weather depends on motion. A ridge arrives, it warms and dries things out for a few days, and then it moves on, and the next trough brings relief. That rhythm is what distinguishes normal weather variability from extreme events. When the rhythm stops, when the wave freezes in place, the normal variability becomes something else entirely. An amplified stalled Rossby wave means a ridge that doesn't move. A ridge that doesn't move is a ridge that persists. And a ridge that persists for days or weeks is the atmospheric engine of extreme events. Prolonged heat, extended drought, sustained fire weather conditions, and all the surface consequences that flow from them. The soil desiccates, the vegetation stress accumulates, the fire danger index climbs not in single-day spikes but in a slow, relentless escalation that no single overnight recovery can reverse. The formal scientific framework for the most extreme version of this phenomenon is called quasi-resonant amplification, and it was developed over the last decade and a half by atmospheric scientists including Stefan Ramsdorf, Vladimir Petikov, and Michael Mann, among others. The concept starts from the observation that the jet stream's waves can, under the right conditions, become resonant, amplified by a feedback between the wave's natural frequency and the periodic forcing from the geography of the land and ocean surface below. The analogy to acoustic or mechanical resonance is imperfect but instructive. When you push a swing at exactly the right frequency, even small inputs produce large oscillations. When the atmospheric wave's natural frequency aligns with the forcing frequency imposed by the uneven heating and topography of the surface below, the result is similar. The wave grows, its amplitude building beyond what the initial forcing alone would produce, until it reaches a configuration that can persist with minimal external input. When resonance occurs, the wave's amplitude grows dramatically, and the pattern locks into a configuration that can persist for weeks. The result is what you might call a stationary wave pattern. A ridge sitting in one place, a trough sitting in another, both amplified well beyond their normal intensity, both refusing to move, both doing their respective jobs, warming and drying under the ridge, cooling and wetting under the trough for an extended period. Two regions of the hemisphere experiencing opposite extremes simultaneously, linked by the same locked wave pattern, each one's anomaly the mirror of the other's. The mechanism behind why this is becoming more common, or at least why there's compelling evidence that it's becoming more common, is Arctic amplification. The Arctic is warming faster than any other region on the planet. Over the instrumental record since roughly the mid-20th century, the Arctic has warmed at roughly 2 to 4 times the global average rate, a disparity driven by a cascade of feedbacks. Sea ice loss exposing dark ocean water that absorbs more solar radiation than the reflective ice it replaced. Permafrost thaw releasing carbon that further warms the atmosphere. Changes in cloud cover and atmospheric moisture transport that amplify the initial warming signal. The temperature contrast between the Arctic and the tropics, which is the fundamental driver of the jet stream's speed and tightness, is shrinking. A weaker temperature gradient means a weaker jet stream. A weaker jet stream is more susceptible to large amplitude waves, more susceptible to quasi-resonant amplification, more prone to the kinds of locked, persistent patterns that produce multi-week extremes. The physics is not complicated once you see the chain. Warmer Arctic, weaker equator-to-pole gradient, slower, more meandering jet stream, larger Rossby wave amplitudes, more frequent, more persistent blocking patterns, more persistent ridge episodes like the one sitting over the American West right now. Each arrow in that chain is individually well supported by both theory and observation. The chain as a whole is one of the most consequential mechanisms in contemporary climate science, and it is still being argued about at the margins. The precise magnitude of the effect, the relative contribution compared to internal variability, the regional specificity of the signal, even as the broad pattern accumulates supporting evidence with each passing season, this is not speculative. The increased frequency of blocking events in the northern hemisphere mid-latitudes is one of the most consistently documented signals in the observational atmospheric record of the last several decades. The heat dome that produced the Pacific Northwest heat wave in June of 2021, 1,000 people dead in Canada in a matter of days. Temperature records in British Columbia broken by more than 9 degrees Fahrenheit. A town called Lytton reaching 121 degrees before burning to the ground the following day. was driven by quasi-resonant amplification of a western ridge that locked in place and simply refused to move. Attribution scientists worked through the event afterward and concluded that it was virtually impossible without the background of anthropogenic warming, a category of claim they had been reluctant to make in previous decades, but now make with increasing regularity and confidence because the events keep arriving at speeds that outpaced the conventional scientific caution about attribution. The European heat waves of 2022 and 2023, which broke records across France, Spain, Portugal, and the United Kingdom, followed the same atmospheric template. Amplified ridges, stalled circulation, surface temperatures that behaved less like anomalous weather and more like a glimpse of a different climate state. The persistent ridges that drove the extreme Texas winter storm in 2021. Wait, that was a cold air outbreak from an amplified trough, which is the same mechanism operating on the other side of the wave, the same locked pattern, the same quasi-resonant dynamics. Just the trough instead of the ridge, the cold extreme instead of the warm one. The point is that the instrumental record of the last decade is full of events that the quasi-resonant amplification framework explains cleanly, and that simple statistics of weather variability would have classified as essentially impossible. Events in the 1 in 1,000-year category or the 1 in 10,000, arriving not once a millennium but several times a decade. The statistics are not broken. The climate is changing. There is another dimension worth holding on to here, the compounding. A single extreme event driven by a locked ridge is damaging. A sequence of them affecting the same region across multiple seasons with insufficient recovery time between crosses into a different category of impact. Ecosystems, infrastructure, communities, and institutions are not infinitely elastic. They recover from individual shocks if given time. They do not recover from sequences of shocks that arrive faster than the recovery cycle. The quasi-resonant amplification framework suggests that we should expect not just more individual extreme events, but more clustering of them, more instances where the same mechanism drives repeat events in the same region across consecutive years. The American West relationship with drought and fire over the last 15 years looks different when you view it through this lens. It is not a series of unrelated bad luck events. It is a pattern that the physics of a warming Arctic and a destabilized jet stream predicts and increasingly explains. The current ridge over the American West fits this framework. It's a coherent, amplified feature with a spatial scale and organizational structure consistent with quasi-resonant amplification rather than the typical transient ridge behavior of normal spring variability. The geopotential height anomalies in the upper troposphere are not modest. The extent of the ridge's meridional reach, how far north it pushes the boundary between polar and subtropical air, is not within the range of routine variability. The signature is there. It doesn't mean it will persist. Quasi-resonant amplification can also spontaneously decay when the resonance condition breaks down, when the wave number configuration shifts, when a transient disturbance perturbs the pattern out of its locked state. Persistence is not guaranteed by the presence of the mechanism, but it does mean that the mechanism capable of locking this pattern in place for a sustained period is present in the current atmospheric dynamics. The engine is built for persistence. Whether it runs persistently depends on what happens to the resonance condition over the next 2 to 4 weeks. Operational forecast models handle this period with appropriate uncertainty. Beyond about 10 days, the specific evolution of any individual weather system becomes genuinely unpredictable, not because of deficiencies in the models, but because of the fundamental chaotic nature of atmospheric dynamics. What the models can do, and what they are doing in the ensemble products that meteorologists are watching, is characterize the probability distribution of outcomes. How often does the ensemble show the ridge persisting? How often does it show a breakdown? Where does the ensemble spread? And what does that spread tell it about the sensitivity of the pattern to small perturbations in initial conditions? The current ensemble distribution is not showing a definitive answer. It is showing, depending on the model and the initialization time, a range of outcomes that spans from early breakdown to multi-week persistence. That range is itself informative. It tells you that you are in a sensitive moment, a bifurcation point in the language of dynamical systems, where the atmosphere could go either way, and where the direction it goes will determine whether the next several weeks bring relief or continuation. The question of whether the ridge currently dominating the American West is a transient or a regime is, at its deepest level, a question about Rossby wave dynamics and quasi-resonant amplification. And the honest answer from the science is we can see the conditions for persistence. We cannot yet confirm that persistence is occurring. That's the window we're in. That's the test. It is an uncomfortable position for anyone who needs to make decisions about fire preparedness, about water allocation, about energy grid management, about all the practical human systems that the atmosphere governs without asking permission. The science offers probabilities, not certainties. It offers mechanism, not prophecy. And the mechanism it offers is one that has been right repeatedly about the character of the extreme events that have arrived over the last decade. That is not nothing. In a world where the atmosphere is running a different experiment than the one we calibrated our infrastructure and expectations against, understanding the mechanism is the beginning of being able to respond to it. Part 9. What happens if this breaks next week? Let's run the scenario honestly. Let's imagine that by Friday or Saturday, the atmospheric dynamics do what they most commonly do with amplified spring ridges. They evolve. A Pacific trough develops offshore, not an unusual feature for this time of year when the North Pacific storm track hasn't fully retreated to its summer position, and residual baroclinic energy in the upper atmosphere can still organize into meaningful disturbances. The trough deepens, pushes east, and undercuts the ridge edge from the west. The upper-level flow pattern shifts. The jet stream reestablishes its westerly progression. The ridge begins to erode and move east, eventually breaking down into the lower Mississippi Valley and dissipating over the warm, humid air of the Gulf Coast states, its energy absorbed and scattered into the ordinary noise of late spring convection. What would that look like on the ground? The 65-mile-per-hour gusts in the Blue Mountains diminish as the pressure gradient relaxes. The tightly packed isobars that have been driving that flow begin to spread apart, the gradient force weakening hour by hour as the ridge axis retreats. The downsloping flow that's been compressing and drying air as it descends the eastern slopes of the Rockies and Cascades weakens and reverses. Where air was descending, warming adiabatically and pushing relative humidity down into the single digits, the column begins to stabilize differently. And eventually, the flow direction changes. Temperatures in eastern Oregon and Idaho drop back towards seasonal norms. The afternoon highs that have been running 15 and 20 degrees above average, settling back into the range that late May in the Intermountain West is supposed to occupy. The landscape exhales. The red flag warning arc across the northern plains, a continuous band from Montana to Wisconsin that has been lit on the National Weather Service map like a warning stripe across the country, begins to fragment as moisture gradually returns. The relative humidity in the warning zones climbs back above 30% and then 40% as onshore flow from the Gulf of Mexico reasserts itself across the plains. This is one of the reliable features of warm season atmospheric recovery in the central United States. When the ridge retreats and the pressure gradient shifts, the low-level jet that ferries moisture northward from the Gulf reestablishes its overnight presence, depositing dew points that change the character of the boundary layer by morning. The boundary layer in Illinois stabilizes and moistens. The dust potential disappears. The loose soil that has been vulnerable to entrainment by surface winds settles as the winds diminish and the surface moisture fraction recovers. Denver cools off. May returns to being May. In this scenario, the record tied in Denver on May 13th becomes a footnote in the meteorological record for that date. A tied record, not a broken one. Close enough to notable, routine enough to file away. The dusted advisory in Chicago becomes a talking point for weather enthusiasts in the area. Remembered because it was unusual, but not because it was the beginning of anything. A few photographs of brown skies over the lakefront circulate on social media for a week and then disappear from the feed, replaced by other weather surprises and other transient anomalies. The fire departments across the northern plains exhale, the red flag warning cycle off the board, and the 296 active National Weather Service alerts drop back towards something more typical of the season. Incident commanders who have been watching the fuel moisture indices and the fire behavior predictions with concern shift their attention to the next operational period, then the one after that, until the elevated concern dissipates with the pattern. The whole event in retrospect looks like an intense but ultimately transient amplified ridge, notable in its spatial coherence and its geographic reach in the way that it touched so many different warning categories simultaneously, but ultimately just a week in the life of a variable spring atmosphere. A dramatic week, an expensive week in terms of suppression resources pre-positioned and emergency management attention paid, but a week, not a season. This is the most common outcome for amplified ridges. Statistically, most of them break down. The atmospheric mechanisms that restore the normal circulation pattern, the eastward progression of the jet stream, the return of Pacific moisture, the equalization of the pressure gradient are robust. They work most of the time. The jet stream wants to move. The Rossby waves want to propagate. The conditions that enable quasi-resonant amplification require a specific configuration of wave numbers and background flow that can break down as quickly as it assembled, sometimes triggered by a single strong transient disturbance that perturbs the resonance condition past its tolerance threshold. And it would be intellectually dishonest to describe the current situation without acknowledging that most of the time is, probabilistically speaking, the baseline expectation. Honesty about uncertainty runs in both directions. It means not dismissing a pattern because it looks like normal variability when the physics suggests otherwise. It also means not overreading a pattern because it generates genuine concern. But here's what matters about the breakdown scenario. Even if the ridge breaks down this weekend, the episode has occurred. The trigger has fired. The soils across the plains absorbed a week of enhanced drying under the influence of a warm, anomalously dry air mass. The vegetation in the red flag zones experienced a week of critical fire weather stress. Not a day, not an afternoon, but a sustained period during which fuel moisture declined along the entire length of the warning arc. The boundary layer in the Midwest reached desert-level dryness for a matter of days. The grasses in the warning zones crossed from marginally cured to critically cured. These are not conditions that reverse the moment the weather changes. Some of them reverse quickly, but the soil moisture deficit accumulated over the week requires precipitation to refill, and the vegetation recovery requires time as well as moisture. None of these individual effects are catastrophic in isolation, and the recovery mechanisms, soil moisture recharge from precipitation, vegetation recovery during favorable conditions, boundary layer moistening from Gulf return flow, are capable of erasing most of the evidence within a few weeks. One trigger event does not build toward a systemic outcome when the recovery intervals are long enough and complete enough. The atmosphere has absorbed single-week anomalies throughout the instrumental record and returned to baseline. That is how it is supposed to work. The concept of false alarm in pattern recognition is an important one to take seriously and to think carefully about. The human brain and the analytical frameworks that humans build on top of it are prone to pattern completion. We see the beginning of a familiar shape, and we want to complete it before the data actually justifies doing so. This is not a design flaw. It is the feature that allows rapid decision-making in environments where waiting for complete information is more dangerous than acting on partial information. But it becomes a liability in the analysis of complex systems where the partial information can be genuinely misleading. The atmospheric configuration of this week genuinely resembles the structural engine of the Dust Bowl. The broad-scale ridge, the desiccated boundary layer, the dust lofted over agricultural regions that have been ground down by years of marginal precipitation and aggressive tillage, the fire weather spreading across the northern tier. These features, taken together, activate a recognition template, but resemblance is not identity, and early resemblance is not prophecy. The history of meteorology is full of patterns that looked like the beginning of something significant and turned out to be isolated events. La Nina-like conditions in the early 21st century produced several years where western ridge anomalies raised concerns about persistent drying, only to be followed by above-normal precipitation seasons that erased the concern and then some. The drought of 2012, which at its peak covered more than 60% of the contiguous United States, and briefly revived serious conversation about long-term aridification of the plains, broke down within 18 months, dramatically and comprehensively, with above-normal precipitation across much of the drought footprint. The event was real. The catastrophic trajectory that some analysts projected was not. The pattern recognized itself in the template, and the template was wrong about where the pattern was going. And there is a specific hazard worth naming here, which is the hazard of motivated pattern recognition in a period of genuine climate change. We are in an era when extreme events are becoming more frequent and more intense, and when the mechanisms driving that trend, Arctic amplification, jet stream destabilization, quasi-resonant amplification, are real and well documented. That creates a legitimate and important prior. Unusual atmospheric configurations deserve serious attention, but it also creates a risk of over-indexing on that prior, of reading every dramatic spring ridge as the harbinger of something systemic, when in fact the atmosphere retains the capacity to produce dramatic transient events that do not lock into persistent regimes. The signal is real. That doesn't mean every event is the signal. The analytical challenge, and it is genuinely difficult, not a problem that additional data or better models fully resolve, is to hold both truths simultaneously without collapsing either one. The current pattern could be the beginning of something significant. The atmospheric conditions that support quasi-resonant amplification and persistent ridge behavior are present. The background climate state, anomalously dry soils across a large part of the affected region, below normal snowpack in the mountain headwaters, vegetation that entered spring in stressed condition, would compound any persistence in ways that make the consequences of duration nonlinear. 1 week of this pattern is manageable. 2 weeks begins to stress the recovery capacity of ecosystems and fire management systems. 3 weeks or more enters the territory where the atmospheric event and the surface conditions begin to interact in ways that produce outcomes qualitatively different from what a single week can generate. A fire ignited in critically dry, wind-driven conditions in week 1 becomes a fire burning in fuel beds that have been further desiccated through week 2 and week 3. The compounding is real, and it is the reason that duration is not a linear variable in extreme event impact assessment. But the pattern could also be a particularly coherent spring ridge event that produces a dramatic week, generates exactly the kind of concern that something this spatially organized deserves to generate, and then breaks down and leaves behind nothing but a tide temperature record and a dust advisory that future meteorologists cite when explaining why they don't overinterpret individual events. That is a real and plausible scenario. It is probably the more likely scenario in any given instance of amplified ridge activity, for the simple reason that breakdown is more common than persistence. The base rate matters. The base rate is not on the side of the extraordinary outcome, and intellectual honesty requires stating that directly, rather than allowing the concern, generated by the pattern's structural features, to quietly displace the prior probability. The uncomfortable truth, and it is genuinely uncomfortable for anyone whose job requires decisions rather than analysis, is that you can't know which scenario is unfolding until you watch the next 2 to 4 weeks. There is no shortcut. The ensemble forecast products will update twice daily, and the spread will either narrow or widen, and the direction it moves will be informative. The ridge will either erode or it won't, and the erosion or non-erosion will happen on a timeline that the atmosphere controls, not the observers. The question of which scenario this is cannot be answered by the analysis that preceded it. The atmosphere will answer the question on its own schedule, in its own terms, with the indifference to urgency that distinguishes physical systems from human ones. But the question only matters. The answer only registers as an answer. If you're asking it carefully enough to recognize what the response actually means when it arrives, that is the work. Not prediction, recognition. Part 10. What happens if it comes back? Now run the other scenario. The ridge breaks down by early next week as atmospheric dynamics typically require. There's a brief period of more normal spring conditions, some moisture returned to the plains, temperatures dropping back towards seasonal averages. The red flag arc dissipating as the pressure gradient relaxes and the Gulf of Mexico low-level jet reasserts its northward flow of moisture across the central states. The National Weather Service map loses its warning coloration. The fire weather briefings become routine. The atmosphere looks briefly like it's returning to normal. There's a collective exhale from incident commanders and emergency managers and agricultural extension offices monitoring soil moisture indices across the plain states. The anomaly passes, the pattern releases its grip, and then 10 to 14 days later, the upper-level pattern reloads. The ridge rebuilds over the American West in approximately the same position with approximately the same structure. The same geopotential height anomalies reemerge in the upper troposphere. The same amplified Rossby wave configuration reasserts itself. The same blocking signature appears in the ensemble products, and the same surface signatures follow. The red flag arc forms again across the northern plains. Denver heats up again. Dust potential reemerges in the Midwest. The warning map reilluminates. One event is an event. Two events with the same structure and the same geography within a month of each other is the beginning of a pattern, and patterns are where the story changes. Not because the second event is necessarily more intense than the first. It may not be in any of the standard meteorological metrics, not because the individual episodes are by themselves unprecedented in the observational record, but because the same forcing applied to the same surface twice with insufficient recovery time between does not produce the same result twice. The second application lands on a surface that is already degraded from the first. The conditions are not reset, they compound. Here's what's different the second time the ridge fires. The soil across the plains is slightly drier than it was before the first episode because the first episode's week of enhanced evaporation and suppressed precipitation drew down the soil moisture reservoir. The deficit accumulated during the first event is not fully erased by a 10-day recovery interval, especially if that interval brings only near normal precipitation rather than the above normal precipitation needed to refill a depleted reservoir. Soil moisture responds to forcing on timescales of weeks to months in the deeper layers that matter most for vegetation and dust cohesion. A week of partial recovery doesn't undo a week of accelerated loss. The vegetation in the fire weather zones is slightly more stressed. The grasses and shrubs that went through a week of critical humidity conditions emerged from the event with reduced physiological reserves, slower growth, and less canopy density. The leaves that were present before the first event may have partially desiccated and cured during it, and new growth takes time to replace them. The boundary layer in the Midwest, which briefly moistened during the breakdown interval, didn't get enough precipitation during that interval to fully recharge the soil. So the starting point for the second episode's surface conditions is slightly worse than the starting point for the first. That's the degradation gradient. It's subtle in the first cycle, barely noticeable in the data, easy to dismiss as normal variability if you're not looking specifically for it. A soil moisture index that reads at 80% of normal going into the first event might read at 72% going into the second. The vegetation stress index that started the first event at moderate might start the second at moderate to high. These are not dramatic differences. They don't look in isolation like the beginning of a systemic problem. But each subsequent cycle of amplified ridging followed by incomplete recovery leaves the surface conditions slightly worse. The soil moisture deficit accumulates. The vegetation stress builds. The threshold for dust mobilization, which requires both dry soil and sufficient wind, becomes progressively easier to trigger because the soil dryness component is already partway there before each new wind event arrives. The fire weather conditions become more dangerous with each subsequent episode because the fuels are drier at the start of each event than they were at the start of the previous one. The baseline keeps shifting, and it keeps shifting in the same direction. This is the cumulative feedback that, in the 1930s, converted a drought and ridge pattern from a series of individual extreme events into a systemic catastrophe. The mechanism was not sudden. There was no single season in which the southern plains went from marginal conditions to catastrophe in one step. It was incremental, almost imperceptibly so at first. Each summer was slightly worse than the previous one because the recovery periods, the winters, the occasional wet spells, the years of near-normal precipitation were not long enough or generous enough to fully restore the baseline. The system was being progressively degraded between episodes faster than it was being restored. The soil organic matter that had taken centuries of prairie grassland to accumulate had been broken up by the plow, and without the deep-rooted native grass cover to hold the surface and cycle moisture. Through the growing season, the soil structure was increasingly vulnerable to each new drying episode. The farms themselves, the agricultural transformation of the short-grass prairie that made the region productive in the good years, had removed the ecosystem's buffering capacity. When the ridge pattern became persistent and the drought deepened, there was nothing left to buffer. The degradation accumulated to the point where even moderate wind events were mobilizing enormous quantities of topsoil because the surface conditions had deteriorated past the threshold where normal soil cohesion could resist the wind stress. The famous black blizzards, the towering walls of airborne soil that darkened the sky at noon in Amarillo and Oklahoma City and Liberal, Kansas, were not the cause of the Dust Bowl. They were the symptom of a surface that had been pushed through the compounding of multiple cycles of stress and insufficient recovery past the point of cohesion. If the current pattern were to repeat, if the ridge rebuilt in the same geography in June and again in July, and the recovery intervals between episodes were insufficient for full soil moisture recharge, then by late summer you'd be looking at soil conditions across the Central Plains that are meaningfully worse than the starting point in May. Not Dust Bowl conditions, not yet, not from a single summer of pattern recurrence, and not in a landscape where Conservation Reserve Program acres and no-till farming practices and shelter belts provide some degree of surface protection that didn't exist in the 1930s. The agricultural landscape of the contemporary plains is not the same as the broken sod of 1934, but the underlying physics of soil desiccation and wind erosion doesn't change with farming practice. It changes with degree of protection, and protection has limits when the forcing is strong enough and persistent enough. The trajectory would be established. The direction of the trend would be visible in the soil moisture products and the vegetation health indices and the dust optical depth measurements from satellite platforms that didn't exist in 1935. And the question of whether that trajectory is being driven by a multi-year atmospheric regime change, the way the 1930s pattern was driven by persistent La Nina-like oceanic conditions in the Pacific, combined with land surface feedbacks that amplified the initial forcing, would be unavoidable. The wildfire implications of pattern recurrence are more immediate than the dust implications because fire weather conditions can produce catastrophic outcomes from a single event rather than requiring cumulative degradation. A fire ignited under critical conditions doesn't need the fuel to have been drying for 3 cycles. It needs critically dry fuel and wind, and the first cycle can provide both. The northern plains and upper Midwest are not areas typically associated with large, destructive wildfires the way the western states are. The land cover, the fuel types, and the historical fire weather climatology are different from the ponderosa pine forests and chaparral of the Southwest, or the mixed conifer slopes of the Sierra Nevada. But extreme fire weather conditions in regions with limited suppression infrastructure and large areas of continuous fine fuels, the cured grasses and crop residue of the agricultural plains, the grassland forest edge that runs through the Dakotas and Minnesota can produce rapid-fire spread events that outpace firefighting capacity, regardless of how atypical they are for the region. Emergency resources are pre-positioned and scaled based on historical frequency. Regions that rarely experience extreme fire weather have emergency response infrastructures sized for that rarity. When the rarity changes, the infrastructure is wrong-sized, and the gap between what fires can do and what suppression can do opens in ways that are difficult to close quickly. A second red flag arc across the northern plains in June, arriving when grasses have been stressed by the May event and soil moisture is below normal, would not be arriving to the same surface the first arc crossed. It would be arriving to a surface that is already partway down the degradation gradient, a surface that is more ready to burn than it was the first time. And here's the feedback loop that the Dust Bowl pattern eventually established at full scale. The self-reinforcing mechanism that transformed an atmospheric forcing into a surface-driven catastrophe that the current pattern has not yet reached, but could approach under repeated recurrence. Dry soil heats faster than moist soil because it doesn't have the energy sink of evaporation moderating surface temperatures. When the sun hits moist soil, a substantial portion of the incoming solar energy goes into evaporating water, latent heat flux, rather than heating the soil surface. When the sun hits dry soil, that energy sink is gone. The surface temperature rises faster and higher. Hotter surface temperatures increase the sensible heat flux into the boundary layer above, which deepens and intensifies the convective mixing layer. A deeper, more intense boundary layer mixes momentum from aloft more efficiently down to the surface, where it manifests as increased surface winds. Higher surface winds combined with drier soil lower the threshold for dust mobilization. The critical wind speed required to begin moving soil particles decreases as the interparticle cohesion provided by soil moisture is removed. Mobilized dust reduces the albedo of the land surface by coating vegetation with a light-absorbing layer, which absorbs more solar radiation, which further increases surface temperatures. Higher temperatures increase the evaporative demand on whatever residual soil moisture remains, accelerating drying. The loop closes. Dry soil, hotter surface, stronger boundary layer mixing, higher surface winds, more dust mobilization, surface darkening, more warming, drier soil. Each variable in the loop feeds the next. Once this loop gets going, with enough intensity across a large enough area, it becomes partially self-sustaining. The atmosphere doesn't have to keep supplying the extreme forcing. The surface is generating its own amplification of whatever forcing the atmosphere provides. The 1930s had this feedback running at scale across the Oklahoma and Kansas panhandles, eastern Colorado, and western Texas for years. A region roughly the size of New England caught in a loop that the atmosphere had partially triggered, but that the surface was sustaining and amplifying. The atmospheric forcing was real and necessary, The oceanic conditions that drove the persistent dry pattern were real, but the feedbacks that turned the dry pattern into the Dust Bowl required the surface degradation that human land use had created. The physics was waiting for the trigger. The trigger arrived. The current situation has none of that. Not the years of accumulated soil degradation, not the scale of broken sod, not the severity of moisture deficit that the southern plains carried into the mid-1930s. The distance between where things stand in May of this year and where things stood in 1935 is vast, and it should not be obscured by the structural resemblance of the atmospheric pattern. But the first step toward it is indistinguishable in week 1 from an isolated event. The soil moisture anomalies that characterized May 1931 did not announce themselves as the opening movement of a decade-long catastrophe. They look like a dry spring in a region that has dry springs with regularity, in a climate that oscillates between wet years and dry years in ways that farmers and ranchers had learned to absorb and wait out. The pattern looked like other patterns that had resolved. The difference only became apparent in the weeks and months that followed, in the recovery intervals that didn't recover fully, in the summers that came back harder than the ones before, in the gradual accumulation of deficits that never quite got erased before the next deficit was added. That is the nature of compounding. It looks like normal variability until it doesn't, and by the time it clearly doesn't, the gradient is already steep. Part 11. The quiet variables. Nobody is watching closely enough. There are some forces operating in the background of this story that don't fit neatly into the main narrative, but deserve an honest mention because the full picture is always more complex than the central story. And intellectual honesty requires acknowledging complexity even when it doesn't resolve neatly, and even when its acknowledgement makes the overall assessment harder to summarize. The temptation in atmospheric storytelling is to let the most dramatic thread carry everything. To let the Dust Bowl analogy or the quasi-resonant amplification framework dominate the frame until the caveats feel like footnotes. They're not footnotes. They're load-bearing elements of an honest assessment. So here they are. The El Niño Southern Oscillation Cycle is currently in a neutral phase, but trending toward a warm state. An El Niño event developing through the second half of 2026 would be, in many respects, the atmospheric opposite of the oceanic conditions that characterize the Dust Bowl era. This matters because the ENSO cycle is not just a regional weather phenomenon. It is the single most powerful source of predictable interannual climate variability on the planet, capable of reorganizing the large-scale atmospheric circulation in ways that override regional forcing and redirect the tracks of moisture and storm systems across entire continents. La Niña-like conditions in the Pacific, the cool sea surface temperature anomalies in the central and eastern tropical Pacific that characterize much of the 1930s tend to favor western ridging over North America and reduce moisture transport into the interior. The subsidence associated with the La Niña Walker circulation reinforces the kind of blocking patterns that drive persistent drying over the plains. El Niño conditions tend to do the reverse, enhancing precipitation in parts of the central and southern United States, suppressing ridge persistence, and providing a background state that in the past has been associated with reduced drought risk over the Great Plains. The jet stream in El Niño years tends to be more active and more displaced southward across the southern tier, which drives storm tracks into regions that receive insufficient precipitations in neutral and La Niña years. If El Niño conditions develop and strengthen over the next 6 to 9 months, they would represent a significant countervailing force against the kind of sustained atmospheric blocking that would be necessary for the current ridge pattern to develop into a multi-month regime. That's an important variable, and it cuts meaningfully against the most alarming interpretation of the current situation. It doesn't eliminate the relevance of what's happening this week. The ridge is real, the extremes are real, the structural resemblance to Dust Bowl-era atmospheric forcing is real, but it provides a potential mechanism for disruption function that the 1930s lacked. The oceanic conditions of that decade were not neutral. They were actively reinforcing the blocking pattern, providing a warm season background state that made ridge persistence more likely, moisture return less reliable, and recovery intervals less complete. The 2026 oceanic trajectory, if it continues toward El Niño, may be working in the opposite direction. A background state that erodes the resonance conditions rather than sustaining them, that keeps the jet stream more active and less prone to the locked configurations that drive multi-week extremes. Whether that counterforce is strong enough, and whether it arrives quickly enough to prevent meaningful recurrence is genuinely unknown. El Niño development is not guaranteed. The current ENSO forecast shows a range of outcomes that spans from weak warming to moderate El Niño, and the skill of seasonal ENSO forecasts, while real, is far from perfect, particularly during the Northern Hemisphere spring, a period that forecasters call the spring predictability barrier, when the signal-to-noise ratio in the tropical Pacific is at its seasonal minimum and model guidance diverges most widely. Even if El Niño develops on the more robust end of the forecast envelope, its effect on specific regional weather patterns carries significant uncertainty at seasonal and longer timescales. The teleconnections between tropical Pacific sea surface temperatures and mid-latitude circulation is probabilistic, not deterministic. El Niño increases the likelihood of certain outcomes. It does not guarantee them. There are El Niño years with significant western ridge episodes, There are La Niña years without them. The background state shifts the probabilities. It does not write the outcome. There's also the matter of Arctic amplification and its contribution to the wave dynamics that form the physical core of this story. The research on Arctic amplification's effect on mid-latitude circulation is robust in establishing the foundational observations. The Arctic is warming at 2 to 4 times the global average rate. The equator to pole temperature gradient is weakening measurably, and this is theoretically and mechanistically consistent with a slower, more meandering jet stream and increased blocking frequency. These elements of the framework are well supported across multiple lines of evidence. Observational records, reanalysis products, and the large ensemble climate model simulations that allow scientists to isolate the effect of Arctic warming from the background noise of internal variability. But the precise relationship between Arctic amplification and specific regional extreme events remains an active area of research with ongoing substantive debate among atmospheric scientists about the magnitude, consistency, and detectability of the effect. Some researchers argue that the Arctic amplification signal in blocking frequency is already clearly visible in the observational record. Others argue that internal variability is large enough to obscure the signal and that the apparent increase in blocking frequency is not yet distinguishable from what natural variability alone could produce. The debate is not about whether the physics is real. It is about whether the effect is large enough and consistent enough across models and observational datasets to attribute specific events or trends to it with confidence. The framework is scientifically credible. The quantitative application of that framework to any specific event, this ridge, this week, this configuration, involves genuine uncertainty that the science has not yet resolved, and that honest engagement with the literature requires acknowledging. And seasonal timing matters in ways that cut in more than one direction. May is not July. The atmospheric dynamics of early summer are different from those of midsummer, when the thermal contrast between the overheated continental land surface and the relatively cooler ocean reaches its seasonal peak and provides the most favorable thermodynamic background for blocking and ridge persistence. In midsummer, the Pacific storm track retreats northward and weakens, reducing the frequency of Pacific disturbances that can undercut a western ridge. The moisture return from the Gulf of Mexico becomes more episodic and less reliable as the season progresses, and the upper-level flow pattern becomes increasingly dominated by the subtropical high. The background conditions for ridge persistence are, in other words, more favorable in July and August than they are in May. The fact that this pattern is appearing in May means we are at the beginning of the high-risk season rather than the middle of it. The window is opening, not closing. If the pattern is going to develop into something persistent, the summer progression of the seasonal cycle is still ahead of it, still capable of providing the background state that makes persistence easier to sustain. If it's going to break down and not return, the breakdown conditions are also still partly available in May in ways they won't be in August. The Pacific storm track still has some residual activity. The Gulf moisture return is still more reliable than it will become later in summer. The atmospheric dynamics are still closer to their spring configuration than their summer one. May is a month of genuine meteorological ambiguity in the mid-latitudes, poised between the active transitional dynamics of spring and the locked amplified dynamics of summer. The pattern's emergence in May is not reassuring exactly. Early season establishment of a persistent regime is how the worst outcomes develop. But it is also not unambiguously alarming in the way that the same pattern appearing in late June or July would be. What all of these variables add up to is a picture of genuine complexity. Multiple forces operating simultaneously with different vectors on different timescales, with different degrees of